What did the US do? Same set of policies. Tariff wars, limiting Japanese investment, involuntary export controls, and the Plaza Accord forcing the Japanese to appreciate. There was no ideological differences there. What did the Japanese do? They submitted because US was the big guy and it was the ally. The problem is China's not going to submit. China is going to go as far as it can. It believes it has the right to pedal its way to prosperity, into technological and economic prosperity. That is kind of along the same lines with David's point, but that's the Chinese view.
So what Beijing is investing in is what it calls 话语权, this billions of dollars into dominating discourse in every language, in every country. This is why you have TikTok being flooded with anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic content, pro-Russian, pro-Venezuelan, pro-North Korea.
I would say that if the US had not just completely kicked away China, maybe China wouldn't have such great relations with Russia, right? They are edging towards together because it needs to balance that relationship. But I do challenge the framing that Matt has come up with, the premises, right? Because the foisting of the model, of the Chinese model onto the world, or causing a Western disintegration, I'm sorry, that's way exaggerating Chinese capabilities and the scope of its ambitions.
I mean, have you considered what the cost is of allowing China to continue stealing American intellectual property, or the hollowing out of our manufacturing base? Is that not a tax on the American people? What about fentanyl?
American companies are willingly giving their technology to Chinese in order to have access to the market.
I personally
it's $1
interviewed...
billion for consumers.
Yeah. Okay.
American companies want that access, and they're not forced to give it over. Microsoft doesn't have to give source code. They make a conscious decision at the CEO board level to do that for access.
Brace yourself for a heated exchange as Economist Keyu Jin goes head-to-head with former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger. This isn't your average conversation. It's a powerful collision of viewpoints that could transform how you understand America's stance on China. It's a must-watch to get a clear understanding to today's geopolitics.
Keyu, your book is, I think, very illuminating about the different generations that we see in China. The generation in power that Xi Jinping personifies is the generation shaped by the Cultural Revolution. But if one looks a little further ahead, the next generation doesn't seem to have anything like the same preoccupations. I mean, I don't know how much you worry about this war scenario, and maybe you should tell us if it's something you worry about. And if it's not, is there a reason to imagine that, I don't know, 10 years from now, the mood will be quite different because there'll be a generational change in politics in both countries?
I do want to come back to the new generation in a little bit, because they will shape China's future, politically, economically, and impact on the world. So that's an important point. Even if China doesn't change as a country, as a political system, the people change, you have practically a different country. But first of all, let me just comment on a few other things that have been previously mentioned. As you rightly pointed out, to say that this is all China's fault seems like it's a little bit beyond belief. It's important to see, not just apply just one American perspective on everything. It's important to see the other perspective. First of all, China rejects the notion that China and US are in a current Cold War. You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to be animostic towards the Americans on Chinese social media. So just taming the nationalism in China. What do the Chinese think about all of this, right? Coming back to some of what David has said. Chinese believe it's competition. Number two, rising up so fast, catching up to number one, economically and technologically speaking. It's not political, it's not ideological, according to the Chinese, because look at Japan. In the 1980s, Japan was an ally, democracy. It swept the country with Japanese electronics, exports of cars, and most importantly, it won the semiconductors race. What did the US do? Same set of policies. Tariff wars, limiting Japanese investment, involuntary export controls, and the Plaza Accord forcing the Japanese to appreciate. There was no ideological differences there. What did the Japanese do? They submitted because US was the big guy and it was the ally. The problem is China's not going to submit. China is going to go as far as it can. It believes it has the right to pedal its way to prosperity, into technological and economic prosperity. That is kind of along the same lines with David's point, but that's the Chinese view. But that said, what has compounded the problem is there has been woefully bad communication between the two and an utter lack of mutual cultural appreciation. So my point is, it's both of them that got to where we are today. Speaking about cultural misguidance, China, did it really need to announce Made in China 2025? China's going to dominate in all strategic emerging sectors? Boof, that was a Sputnik moment that spooked Americans, and on came this onslaught of export controls and all that stuff. But Chinese pronouncing they want to be number one, that is so common. It's President Xi, but it's all the universities I've interviewed with. Every one of them want to be number one in Asia by 2030. It's the Chinese students. I made the mistake of doing the same when I first got to the US. It's a cultural phenomenon. Now, coming back to the US, did the US need to unleash all these demonization of China and these policy and tariff wars and export controls, making the Chinese believe that the sole goal of the US is to hold it down? That's miscommunication problem. There's even little communication between the two in times of urgency, and I think that is dangerous.
Can I pursue one part of that? And that's kind of popular attitudes. It's very hard to gauge those, of course, because there are no opinion polls that we can rely on. And there's clearly nationalism in China. As you say, the regime actually has to rein it in on social media. Yeah. But nationalism and being ready to go to war are different things. And what I can't judge, and this is where the analogy with Germany pre-1914 is quite helpful, is how psychologically ready for war the Chinese people are. The German population was mentally ready for war by 1914. That was very clear. But I'm not so sure about China today. How psychologically ready for war are ordinary Chinese people if a crisis over Taiwan suddenly breaks out?
I think you pointed out the right question. What concerns Chinese in their daily lives is not war and national rejuvenation because of Taiwan. It's still, are our kids going to be educated? Are we going to afford the housing, for our kids to get married and stuff like that? But coming back to the issue of Taiwan, and we talked about this 2027, I want to totally agree with David. There's no such timeline. If there's ever going to be a timeline, maybe 2049, because hear me out here. I disagree with the point of view that there has been a radical change towards Taiwan on the part of Xi. Let me tell you why. Pretty much what he has been saying has been pretty much the party guideline since. Okay, Taiwan, inalienable part of China. 1995, 2000 white papers, not rule out military force or other drastic measures in the event of independence or grave turn of events. 1995, 2000 white papers. Reunification is essential for national rejuvenation, goes back to 1997 by Jiang Zemin. Now, the more important issue is if China believes that there is a permanent loss of Taiwan, that there is no route towards unification by peaceful means or whatever means, then that's the problem. So it's condition-driven rather than timeline-driven.
So if we want to look at communication as being a problem, how to explain the fact that China has systematically evicted every American journalist who speaks Chinese? They're no longer allowed in China. They can't even come to cover a short event. Beijing does not want people who understand China coming in. It's because Beijing has invested billions of dollars in trying to monopolize all discourse about China.
With New York Times,
Yes, right.
Keith Bradshaw.
Keith is a friend of mine. He doesn't speak Chinese, but he's a great reporter.
No, he understands China.
The only reporter that they allowed to stay from the United States was Keith Bradshaw because he has to depend on government-provided, in some cases, government-provided translators. He's the only one that they allowed to stay. Everyone else has been booted out. New York Times, all the other publications. And so, I've been banned from China after I gave a speech. You were talking about respecting history. I gave a speech about 100 years of China's history, starting with the May 4th movement after World War I. And I was banned for having delivered that speech. So what Beijing is investing in is what it calls 话语权. There's billions of dollars into dominating discourse in every language, in every country. This is why you have TikTok being flooded with anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic content, pro-Russian, pro-Venezuelan, pro-North Korea, pro-Communist Party content.
There's zero. I challenge you. I challenge you coming up with credible evidence that TikTok's opinions anti-Israel, pro-Hamas is back to China. I challenge you. Can you provide any single case in which the opinion of pro?
So luckily,
Congress this would warm up.
The U.S. Congress, a bipartisan committee late last year, did a whole hearing on this, where they looked at the metrics. Actually, the ones that at the time were provided by TikTok itself. And they compared what kind of content trends on Instagram and X and all these other platforms. And they found it was equal on anything that was politically neutral. If you're talking about Taylor Swift, it's exactly the same level of content on TikTok as you get on Instagram. But then if you're talking about something that is anti-American, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, it starts to take off by multiples and then multiples of multiples on TikTok. Now, this shouldn't be a mystery to us. Beijing controls the algorithms because the Chinese...
Are you publishing this in Science, the magazine? You will be rejected.
Who is the editor-in-chief of ByteDance? Do you know who the editor-in-chief is of ByteDance, which is the parent company that controls?
That's a parent company. TikTok is totally different. It's all US company.
So I'll answer the question. The Chinese Communist Party secretary appointed by the central government to govern all apps and content under ByteDance. TikTok is one of the apps under ByteDance. He is the editor-in-chief. And
operation-wise, the TikTok is totally independent.
One thing that's true, though, David, is, and this is one really for you, Keyu, TikTok's Chinese equivalent is a very different thing from the TikTok that we have in the United States.
Same editors, same back office, same engineers, same algorithms, tweaked to deliver radically different content. It's to build up the Communist Party's image in China, and here it's to disintegrate the fabric that ties our pluralistic democracy together.
Keyu, can I ask you a particular question about how the Chinese see the world? David made the very interesting point earlier that there's considerable suspicion between China and Russia, despite the no-limits partnership between Xi and Putin. This is music to the ears of American policymakers who would like nothing better than for there to be another China-Russia split as there was in the first Cold War. What's your sense of how ordinary Chinese people think about the no-limits partnership? Or do they not think about it?
No, of course they think about it. I mean, history has proven you just can't trust, Soviet Union, Russia, and it's a short-term relationship. But I would say that if the U.S. had not just completely kicked away China, maybe China wouldn't have such great relations with Russia, right? They are edging towards together because it needs to balance that relationship. But I do challenge the framing that Matt has come up with, the premises, right? Because the foisting of the model, of the Chinese model onto the world or causing a Western disintegration, I'm sorry, that's way exaggerating Chinese capabilities and the scope of its ambitions. I wouldn't flatter the Chinese to think that. China just believes, and again, rightly or wrongly, China can just stand aside and look at whatever the threat it is to democracy itself. The biggest threat to the US is not China, it's the US itself, just like China is its own biggest threat. So that model of foisting Chinese development model or authoritarianism to the rest of the world, I just don't agree with that.
You said something really interesting there, that the biggest threats to China are China itself. Say a bit more about that, because one important aspect of this debate is what is going on inside China, inside the Chinese economy, and also within China's youth, where youth unemployment has become such a sensitive issue that they don't publish statistics on it anymore. I mean, maybe we in the US are worrying too much about China's strength and underestimating its inner weaknesses. How do you see those demographic problems or debt-related problems? Is your view of the Chinese economy pessimistic over a 10-year time horizon or more optimistic?
So this is precisely the point that, China's economic challenges are very real. So are they really thinking about creating extra chaos and external challenges that would cost, massive economic catastrophes when its most serious challenges are internal?
Because the classic question that people ask, a typical historian's question is, isn't the most dangerous time when an authoritarian regime starts to run into economic trouble or social trouble? Isn't that when it's most likely to take strategic risk? And Hal Brands has made this argument in his recent work. So help me understand this. You're saying the opposite.
Yeah, the legitimacy of the Communist Party today is still primarily pragmatic and economic. And the youth unemployment, just think about this. I mean, the youth came out to protest. Within a fortnight, China dismantled the longest, most draconian lockdown. Okay, and youth, now there's unemployment. By the way, for all the things that you've said about Xi dialing back, Xi has never said no to any opening up policies to foreign financial institutions, swap connects, bond connects. Tesla is being subsidized by the Shanghainese government, driving all around the Chinese streets. Xi has canceled visa requirements for a number of European countries. Why? Opening up more. So that global integration is still there. And for all the chaos that you've mentioned, he has also said, we will not tolerate chaos in the region.
So does that mean that we should expect a rather different tone from the July 3rd plenum, which is just coming up, which has been postponed? I mean, that's going to make the news here in the US. What's the message going to be? That reform and opening up is back?
A lot of it is going to be economic.
Right.
And coming back to your question, high debts, high youth unemployment, economic growth slowing down. 900 million people still vastly undereducated, underemployed, not reaching middle income by international standards. People not being able to afford housing for their children to procreate. These are real issues. That's what the Chinese people talk about. We don't hear about Taiwan and going to war as a way to kind of mobilize the national psyche. It's about economics. And I won't go into details, but there have been a return to pragmatism. And this is always a pendulum swing. In times of confidence, more Mao. In times of crisis, more Deng.
Yes, sir.
Okay, just as a quick intro, I lived in Asia for 14 years. The majority of that was in China. I worked there for 30 years with Chinese companies, etc. I will say I'm much closer to Keyu than Matthew at this point in terms of the thought process and the outcome and where it goes. It's important for people to remember China has 4 times the US population, which lives on half the landmass. It's basically, imagine 1.4 billion people east of the Mississippi, right? What does China care about? What have I always taken away from my time in China is stability and economic progress, pulling people out of poverty. And China's probably pulled more people out of poverty than the rest of the world combined. Keyu, my question actually is for you. I think all this talk about Taiwan is overblown. What is the risk to American citizens, American consumers, the American economy of a complete rift with China whereby we're not able to import the tariffs that are talked about are a tax on the American consumer. It's not what Donald Trump said, that China pays for it. The US consumer pays for it. What happens in that rift? Because you're an expert in international trade flows. Thank you.
Keyu, that's a question to you.
Well, when we say that China has already assumed some kind of normality in terms of this, kind of disengagement, economic disengagement with the U.S., China's primary trading partners in renewables and all EVs is with Europe. So it matters much more what Europe does in terms of policies to China than the rest. But I gave you the example of Tesla, right? And all these American companies in China. Apple, for instance, still making huge profits in China. I think they make really, a very important combination. The Chinese youth still love the NBA. They love Hollywood movies. We need to keep them, keep that going. But I think that banning, sanctioning companies left and right, banning Chinese investment going to the U.S. 22% drop in Chinese students going to the U.S. since 2019, but 85% of Chinese students have returned to China. That's voting with their feet. So keep the knowledge exchange open, keep the collaborative research. And by the way, for every dollar that U.S. spends on renewable investment, China spends 3. It's important to
Matt, it's undeniable that there are costs to U.S. consumers of worse relations with China.
Yeah.
What's your answer?
Let me ask, sir, I mean, have you considered what the cost is of allowing China to continue stealing American intellectual property or the hollowing out of our manufacturing base? Is that not a tax on the American people? What about fentanyl?
American companies are willingly giving their technology to Chinese in order to have access to the market.
I personally
it's $1
interviewed-
billion for consumers.
Okay.
American companies want that access, and they're not forced to give it over. Microsoft doesn't have to give source code. They make a conscious decision at the CEO board level to do that for access.
When the U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer opened this investigation into the systematic theft of our IP, as well as policies in China that require you, as the condition of getting market access, again, you could say, well, it's fine, we just give up the Chinese market. But if you want that access, you do have to give over that IP. And that has only intensified over the last few years with China's new laws that require all data in China, all data, to be not only accessed, but controllable by the government. So what about fentanyl, right? I mean, Beijing, Congress just came out with a bipartisan report that said not only is China the main provider of all the chemicals that are being synthesized into the fentanyl, the illegal, not the legal stuff, the illegal fentanyl that's killing 80,000 Americans a year. The Chinese government is also providing sustained, robust subsidies to those companies to keep providing the poison on our streets. Is that not a tax on the American people?
Kay, you wanted one last word, and then we're going to go to the
Matt, the opposite is actually happening with EVs and renewables. Look at what European companies are doing. They said they want to invest and sign joint venture companies with the Chinese companies to get their technology. And what happens? They're happening everywhere, all around Europe. It's just the cycle. China has a better technology. They're going to work together, access for market. It's just flipped.